Hey everyone, welcome back to No Talking Points, iPolitics signature podcast. I'm Marco Vigliotti, the editor-in-chief here at iPolitics, and I'm joined as always by Brian Storseth, our publisher. And today we have our returning guest as always for our major projects reporter. And we have two other guests, Cecely, an account director at Burson, and Quito Maggi, the CEO and president of Mainstreet Research, one of Canada's top polling firms. Thanks everyone for joining us. We have, again, no shortage of topics. It's been, even though, the House isn't sitting this week, we certainly have a lot to dissect and go through, especially in the wake of a very, very busy past week. I wanted to kind of actually start us off with election speculation. We're looking at a bunch of moving numbers when it comes to our polling. It looks like the Liberals are trying to pull ahead, and it's just raising that speculation. And of course, on Friday, we had the big decision from the Supreme Court invalidating the result in Terrebonne, setting up another by-election, which is pushing the Liberals further from that 172 majority threshold. Brian, you've mentioned it on our last show that maybe the Liberals waited too long in 2021. Are we going to see a rush to the polls right now, or is this all just media speculation kind of getting out of hand?
Well, straight to the clickbait to begin the show. I like it. Look, I don't think anybody knows what's going to happen. I think certainly the polling seems to and I'm interested to hear from Quito today, but the polling seems to be looking like the Liberals will have a window in the spring potentially to go. I don't think anything's changed in the message that now's not the right time for the country to have an election with everything that's going on. But it certainly looks like with the numbers the way they are, that there will be an opportunity in the spring for it. There's also the constant rumors about floor crossers and everything else, right? I don't know. I think we're going to have to wait and see. I think the pollsters certainly indicate that there may be an opportunity for it, but just because the Liberals are up in the polls doesn't mean that they'll be so callous as just to go. If Parliament's
Cecily, you were kind of there for what happened in 2021.
Yeah.
Is that a fair read that, like, if you were advising the PM right now, would you think you got to strike when the iron's hot right now, or what would you say to them?
Yeah, look, and I think there's always a risk on both ends, right? There's always a risk in going what could be perceived as too early a time, especially given the fact that the Carney government's been in for roughly a year, right? The risk there is not having established a clear narrative to justify going to the polls. And that's, I know, something you touched on in terms of the 2021 campaign. That's something that the leader and then the candidates have to wear and justify throughout that campaign. It doesn't necessarily go away if you don't have that clear message established. I think there's also a risk in waiting too long, right? There's, of course, a government that has a longer time in office has a mandate to run on and a record to run on, but you also have a record to run against. The opposition parties have a record to run against. We see the numbers publicly available, but the folks at PMO and the folks at the party will also have their own internal polling to indicate kind of, all right, does this inform our decision to go now, wait, whatever it may be? There's also consideration around election readiness, whether that's operationally, financially, whatever that may be. The thing that I see as distinct with this particular government from the Trudeau government that I was a part of is that there's a variety of groups involved in advising the PM more directly. So you've got the career public servants that have been brought in. You've got the private sector leaders that have been brought in. And maybe those folks have a different consideration around less of the partisan political consideration, maybe more around, okay, well, we need more time to get things done. Major projects, the various economic strategies, we've just seen the defense strategy released. And those trade relationships that are being strengthened and established around the world. So things to consider. There's also an electoral calendar to consider with Quebec going in the fall. Various considerations, all to say, I think there's there's always a risk in going early. There's always a risk in going later, but there's a lot of things to consider.
Yeah. And Aya, we've had this discussion, I feel like, a lot, and Cecily brings up a good point. Like, what do you run on? And I know a lot of this, at least last spring, a lot of talk was about, getting major projects built, getting things out the door, getting us, prepared to deal with the big shift in the U.S. From your kind of from your perch, do you think there's anything that's been happening on those fronts that make, that allows the government to package together some compelling message, to Cecily's point, to give you a narrative to run on, whether it's, keep the progress going, or we need a mandate to do X, Y, and Z.
Yeah, I mean, I know there's folks around the country who believe that Carney's not moving fast enough on major projects and that the major projects office is just this other bureaucracy, and we haven't actually seen, final investment decisions or construction milestones really happen because of the major projects office. I think the jury's kind of still out on that, and we are seeing, early sign of diversification of trade and investor confidence in certain projects. So I'm not sure if he'll have compelling messaging there if election season comes around. But I do wonder, and I would put this question to you guys, if the North American Free Trade Agreement falls apart in the middle of election season, would that help Carney or hurt?
Well, I was just going to say, I think there could be a narrative and justification around Mark Carney and the Liberals are not just in the position of government to deal with CUSMA renegotiations and Donald Trump, which, of course, was the big ballot question in 2025. But they've been able to make progress and continue to do that with folks in Mexico this week with this massive trade delegation on. We're not just dealing with the US, we're establishing relationships internationally. And you need that adult in the room to continue making progress on this as we open up a new era for Canadian economic development and trade. And so if there's an opportunity to continue that progress, and I feel like with the narrative that Carney established in Switzerland in January, they're equipped with some of that to continue going ahead and some of the groundwork that was laid out last year bilaterally in a lot of these places. Let's see what progress can be made, but I think the pieces are there to demonstrate the diversification and strategy and kind of build that narrative as well.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a good point. What about you, Quito? What would your numbers kind of suggest if, to Aya's point, if we do have a complete meltdown? I mean, I guess we're kind of experiencing it already. And if another complete meltdown of these trade talks in the middle of an election campaign, does it help the Liberals or does it hurt them?
I think, what we saw for the most of the second half of 2025, essentially this stalemate between Liberals and Conservatives in the polls, essentially where they left off at the last election. And then, what we saw in January is a big spike, and this followed, the Davos speech. It followed, a few other things, including Donald Trump insulting the Canadian military. And where did we see those changes? Atlantic Canada, which has the highest, per capita population of serving and retired Canadian forces, and among young people. This kind of, when you have national identity and I guess national pride, although not quite in the same way as Americans, at an all-time high, reactions to Donald Trump will always favor the incumbent government or whoever is standing up for Canada. I think that's benefiting both Doug Ford and Mark Carney right now. It is an emotional response. And that's why I said after our last poll in January was that it could just be temporary, because emotional reactions on voter intention don't tend to last. And to your point that Brian was making, or that you were asking the question about timing of an election, right now is, by right now I mean sometime in the next 3 months, probably the best time. The second best time is hard to identify. Maybe it's next spring. The fall is sort of very difficult for a number of reasons. Electoral calendar, Ontario and BC both have municipal cycles. Quebec has an election, and then we get into US midterms and the noise that all creates. So I think right now is the best time.
And that's a good point, Guido. I mean, Brian and I think we're talking about this, earlier about how, the midterms could provide, significant reboot against Trump. We already saw that the House voted, I know it's a symbolic measure, but against the imposition of those tariffs against Canada. If we go into an election and we don't have it in the spring, and Trump, as expected, as most sitting presidents do, loses seats in the midterms, he has a narrow majority in the House, like Brian, if we don't go now, to Quito's point, do you kind of lose your opportunity to make, who's best suited to run, to stand up against Donald Trump? The ballot box question again, and if so, is that your ace in the sleeve? Like, do you lose a huge opportunity by waiting?
Well, do they lose an opportunity by waiting? Not if they fulfill their promises and govern well. I think if they went now, it's opportunistic, just as it was opportunistic for Doug Ford to go when he went. There's a big argument to be made, talking Aya and major projects, that you can't afford to lose. That you would lose if you go to an election plus reforming government plus, like, So do we want to get a bunch of things done now, or is like, it does seem like if there's an election called, it's because it's opportunistic for the Liberals to gain more seats. I mean, I don't hear an argument that it's best for the country to have an election less than a year after the election.
And Cecely, I don't want you to repeat yourself, but like, does it matter though? You're saying it's something that candidates have to wear? I guess it's a question that they'll get asked. But when it comes to decision day, I mean, is it really going to hurt anyone if people think, oh, this is a cynical move by the Liberals?
Well, this is the thing, like, they only wear it if the narrative isn't clearly established and the message isn't there in terms of why now. I mean, you mentioned Premier Ford going to the polls last year. There's other circumstances at play, including what the opposition parties look like, but he came in with a third majority, right? I think, again, if the message is clear around why now and why the government needs to be equipped with the stability of a majority or more stability in Parliament to continue getting big things done or to get those big things done, I think that's something that that could be articulated and support both the air war and the folks in central campaign, but also those folks in the ridings, those candidates running locally.
And I want to kind of, dovetail into our second topic. Considering we've heard these drumbeats about an election call, it does seem a bit curious that one of the first things we saw as the sitting started was, the Conservative signal, hey, that GST rebate you're talking about, we don't think it goes far enough. We don't think it's a great thing, but you know what? We're going to fast track it through Parliament because we don't have any objections to it. Aya, do you think that, this is really, we're entering a new era of good feelings and, the temperature's been taken down, especially in light of Pierre winning his leadership review? Or is this all just the Conservatives posturing to just say, hey, we're not going to give you any reason, to Cecely's point, to make a case to call an election by, being obstructionist?
I think there's definitely a lot of that going on, but I also think it would be a bad look to not be cooperative on a measure that's meant to help people who are hungry. And I think they did a good job at pointing out that, this wasn't part of the budget. This does add unplanned spending to the budget. And I know the PBO had a different number than the Liberals had, like Finance Canada had. And ultimately, it doesn't do much in terms of reducing food prices and some of the more long-term things that we would need to see in place to address that issues. I understand, it's a hard thing to support, but at the same time, you can't be seen as not supporting it. But it is then in the end kind of a win for the Liberals, who get seen as a government who enhances these measures for more vulnerable parts of the population, and then get cooperation from the opposition party on it. Yeah, a win for the Liberals for sure.
And Quito, is this something that Pierre has to keep doing? Like, I think the narrative's been said time and time again that his personal unpopularity or his negatives are weighing down the Conservative brand. Is this something he needs to do going to the next election? Look like he's more open, that he's more, I don't know, agreeable than the kind of, flame throwing, bridge burner that we saw, especially in the last Parliament?
Yeah, it's a really difficult line that Poilievre has to run there, because on the one hand, there are two societies. One that is traditional mainstream media, watching CBC, CTV, Global, etc. There's kind of a whole second Canada out there that is driven primarily by younger Canadians, younger voters who are watching different streams. And so he's got to be careful, because if he's seen as too political by that base of his, they'll abandon him and not that they're going to go out and vote Liberal in the next election, but those folks might just sit on their hands in the next election. And then the other half of it is, for him to grow, he has to grow outside that base, certainly for the Conservatives to secure government, whether minority or a majority. It's really an all or nothing for them. So that's the hardest line the Conservative leader has to walk, maintaining the base and expanding the voter pool. It's not an easy job.
Quito, I just, with the coalition that Pierre has put together, because you bring a really good point up about the coalition. He has built a different coalition than Prime Minister Harper had, and Conservatives probably traditionally have had over the years. Is that coalition big enough in the areas where they need to gain seats, or does he have to grow, in your mind?
Well, he has to grow in just a few demographics, primarily female voters, and seniors. So for those two, it's harder for Pierre's message to reach female voters and senior voters because of the channels that his message are on. So that is the challenge from a communication standpoint for Conservatives. And I should add that, if we were in a traditional place where the NDP is somewhere between 18 and 20% in the polls, Pierre Poilievre would have a majority government. It's because of this unique binary landscape that we've only really seen for the last and what happens now once the again about the point about around the timing is what happens when the NDP elects a new leader, and it's going to be Avi Lewis, and what happens when they go from 8, where they're sitting today, or in the Mainstreet poll 6, I think was our latest number. Some polls have it as high as 10, 11. When they return, if they return back to sort of their traditional 15 to 18%, then Pierre Poilievre's math becomes very different, Brian, to your question, right? He doesn't have to grow at that point. A Conservative that has over 40% of the vote share, that's a majority under any other circumstance. He's as big as he needs to be in a traditional Canadian election. It's just we find ourselves in this situation where the NDP is at an absolute historic bottom.
And Quito, though, it seems like, you're talking about, that binary choice that is pushing people into the liberal conservative camp. And maybe, Cecily, you could talk about this. It seems like this is going to be one of the only issues that I could imagine that's going to create that divide where people, there's not, that is going to be an issue that is going to overtake all those other concerns. Brian, you've mentioned, relentlessly about how affordability issues, could be this government's Achilles heel. But it seems like this issue is the only thing that's going to create that, you're either with liberals or conservatives. So to the discussion we're having, it seems like as long as if this issue no longer becomes top of mind, then the liberals have to craft together an entirely different coalition, entirely different strategy. Is that a fair read, Cecily?
Well, look, I think just going back to the crux of this vote, in particular on the GST rebate, I think it is a smart policy move for the Liberals to have brought this forward as a standalone piece of legislation to address that vulnerability, right? Like, we see, based on Abacus's latest data, that affordability continues to be the top issue for voters. And the CPC are still leading on it, but by a margin of a couple points. When they're voting for that and to pass that into law quickly, I think they frankly can't be seen as being obstructionist and not cooperating on that, on affordability measures. So it does make sense to have them doing that. Does that mean they're going to be cooperative on everything? I don't think so. I think it's smart for them to have done that now to take away that wedge from the Liberals. I think one of the things that did stick out to me that Quito mentioned was that Pierre is not able to get female voters on side because he's not reaching them where they're at. I do wonder if that's a matter of the channels he's using, or if that's frankly how he comes across to female voters or to women voters more so than maybe the senior demographics. But that's just maybe my personal perspective on that.
Mm-hmm.
But I've heard from Conservative candidates and MPs that were at the door that seniors just were not accessible, even less accessible than a soccer mom, for instance. Like when I used to door knock a long time ago, I used to love it when somebody older would answer the door because it was going to be a good conversation generally. Now it seems like it's not, and that's, I think, really disconcerting for the Conservative Party because they're also more likely to vote. But the only other thing I would point out is it's not just the C10. There's several pieces of legislation that are starting to move through committee, and I really think this is how minority parliaments are supposed to work, right? Right now, the government has the leverage over the Conservatives, so Conservatives are moving things. As things change, and it might be the NDP, it might be the Bloc, it's how minority parliaments work effectively. And generally they work for 16 to 18 months before. This is early to be having election speculation in a minority parliament. I mean, you never know.
Well, let's talk a bit about a piece of legislation where there doesn't seem to be that unanimity yet, and that's the budget implementation bill. The Conservatives say that they're not going to support it unless the Liberals get rid of changes that they think basically gives the ministers powers to grant wide exemptions to corporations from, a bunch of laws. It is interesting. Firstly, the Conservatives, of course, voted against that motion in the House to support the budget and the budget implementation bill, as the name suggests, is just measures that make changes to laws to allow the budget to go into effect. So, that's an interesting move from their part. But, maybe you can walk us through a bit about what those changes mean and why they're kind of causing a bit of a flurry of controversy on the Hill right now.
I mean, this story is so interesting because Le Devoir first started talking about it in November, and there just wasn't a lot until like 2 weeks ago when the bill sort of made its way through committee and the Conservatives started talking about it and asking for more clarity on this clause. So Division 5, Part 5 basically says that a minister can grant an exemption to anyone as long as it doesn't go against the criminal code and it has some kind of justification tied to innovation, economic growth, and that sort of thing. So the wording is pretty vague, and the Bloc was concerned about it in the fall, and now the Conservatives are concerned about it for the same reason, because they would like to see more layers of approval, like maybe it's a cabinet decision as opposed to a ministerial decision. And maybe, like in other G7 jurisdiction, the exemptions are more closely linked to innovation as opposed to economic growth, for example, which is a lot more broad, right? Like you could justify a lot of exemptions through that lens, whereas innovation would be more specific. And seeing Minister Champagne say that, right? Like we need to have policies like this if we're going to compete with other similar jurisdictions. And you see a lot of that because the laws aren't written for new innovative products. Like, for example, ride-sharing apps, when they first came online, they were basically illegal for 6 months, right? Because they broke so many rules. And that's the idea behind these exemptions, is you create what they call like a regulatory sandbox where you can play around with rules and you can launch these new ideas and these new products into this sort of experimental regulatory space. So I think, there's a need for policies like that. It's just the wording of the bill is broad. And we're seeing negotiations right now between Conservatives and Liberals about how to make it more specific and maybe add more accountability.
Yeah, and what do you think about that, Brian? Like I said, I think Aya brings a good point that there does seem to be maybe potentially a way to bridge these differences, and it does come down to the wording of it. Do you think like that climb down, for lack of a better word, the fact that the Conservatives are basically saying we're on board for this BIA, even though we voted against the motion, that to signal our support for this budget that could have brought about an election? Are they just looking for some easy victory here, just to say, hey, look, we got some concession from this government? Or what's your read of the situation?
I think bureaucrats often write laws that give them the most expansive powers that they can. And I think this is honestly, it's a sign on both sides. Like the Liberals aren't saying, well, as we've talked about for the last 10 minutes, they have the upper hand. They could just shove this through. They're saying, well, how do we fix this and adjust this so that it's acceptable to everybody? And it honestly seems like the way that it should work. I've seen this before. It's not just under Liberal governments. It happened to us often where you would, even internal caucus would push back on how something was written. I think this is a sign of government actually working. I think it's also a bit of the maturity that the Carney government brings into things that you haven't necessarily seen other governments always do, right? Like, it's about making things work, and this is a good sign in my mind.
Yeah, what about you, Cecily? Is it, again, a situation where the Conservatives, or I guess to Brian's point, this is a sign that, everyone can cooperate, maybe even for the time being, and maybe for whatever the motivations are, that the fact that we're basically disputing some wording in a bill that is as expansive as a BIA is a good sign for the longevity of this parliament?
Yeah, I mean, I think we saw the House leader out doing some of the weekend shows with McKinnon, who I had a chance to work with at procurement back in the day, but we saw him out kind of discussing that and where this legislation goes. And I think, look, the clause by clause is continuing. It isn't wrapped up yet at committee, so let's see kind of what this looks like when it's reported back to the House. There's always a possibility that the opposition parties, CPC and Bloc, can vote down a clause, or maybe these things change when it comes back to the House. I think if this does go forward in its current state, the government does have an opportunity to communicate why this is needed. If it's tied to that message around, we need to get big things done quickly, Canadians seem to have an appetite around getting things done quickly and are anxious about the impact of tariffs and what our economy is going to look like moving forward. So if there's that argument made and the narrative isn't left up to the opposition to articulate for them, I think that could be an opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
And if If I could add
So
to
go
that,
ahead.
I think like for the Conservatives, there's some political points here to be scored. And you could see that because in committee, they were clipping the MPs, the Conservative MPs that were specifically asking questions about this exemption rule and packaging it for social media. And you could see it appealed to a lot of their base. There was a lot of engagement on this topic, a lot of almost activism on social media to, this is being framed as a power grab by the Liberals, and the Conservatives are there to stop them from getting more expansive powers. So you're negotiating, but I think you're also scoring some points along the way.
Better than the ostriches, I guess. Quito, again, not to be repeating myself, but the fact that we see this movement from the Conservatives on the BIA, like, is this just them just doing everything in their power to avoid an election? Because it seems like your polling is suggesting what everyone else is suggesting, and that is not going to be a pretty ride for them if we went to a vote today.
Yeah, I think they realize that if an election were held today, that it would be pretty grim. Although, it may have spoken too soon. Nanos this morning has it back to a tie, so it could be an outlier or a new trend. But the BIA stuff, this isn't like on the ballot box, right? People outside the Ottawa bubble don't know any of what we're talking about right now. To them, these are just the normal political games. So I don't think it's any play for. It's not a ballot play. It's I think exactly right. Trying to avoid the election while seeming cooperative with the government. There's a very small public win in this for Poilievre.
Yeah, and one thing I also wanted to, I think I kind of breezed past it, but from one jurisdiction to another, we recently did a long read story on Doug Ford's future and his seeming, Teflon Doug perception right now. He's still leading in the polls, comfortably leading, I should say. Yet somehow, there's some trouble in the horizon. Seems like there's a lot of concerns that, some of the same hurdles that this Liberal government faces, specifically around affordability, seem to be pretty low in Doug Ford's favor. But it also seems like it's inevitable that he's going, if he wants another term in office, he'd win. So I'll start with you, Quito. Doug Ford, is it just an inevitability that if he wants it, he's going to win another term in office, or is there some major ruptures underneath the surface that could cost him another term in office?
Every politician has a shelf life. And, I can think of, recent examples, at the beginning or even after the first term in office for Justin Trudeau, Brad Wall, Francois Legault, etc. There's a long list of politicians that, Francois Legault, perfect example. 4 years ago, his approvals were highest in Canada, had just gotten it secured as mega majorities, second one in a row, completely restructured the landscape of Quebec politics. And then less than 2 years in, he was dead and continues to, go downhill. Doug Ford's shelf life is much, much longer than I've ever, maybe not in my lifetime, ever seen. Like there's Hazel McCallion, examples out there as well. But this is unprecedented in the social media age. Usually a politician reaches their shelf life long before this. Justin Trudeau, 7 years in, became after what everyone thought was going to be at least a 12 to 16 year run. So, but what is that thing? And people ask me this all the time, and he does have Teflon. Like he seems to be so adaptable that like people will point out, oh, this is a bad idea. And he'll just turn around and go, yep, you're right. We're going to change that. And let's move on. He did it with the Greenbelt. He's done it with so many things. So I don't know what it's going to take, but eventually people will ask for change. And whenever there's an alternative out there, and there's a Liberal leadership going on right now where that alternative will, I assume, emerge. And if that's a viable alternative, then that's the change Ontarians might choose in the next election.
Look, I think exactly to that point, I think part of this is the fact that he's been able to withstand various crises and address various issues, but a lot of this is because he hasn't truly faced an opposition or a strong opposition. I mean, the NDP just lost their deputy leader to run for the federal Liberals. The Ontario Liberals don't have a leader right now. As Quito said, like they'll select one in the fall, and I'm excited to see how that shapes up as a Liberal living in Ontario. But I think at this point in time, this long into any leader's tenure and any government's tenure, the littlest things can catch and become significantly bigger than initially anticipated. I'll tell you, it's not fun. And that can shift the winds. And if there's an opposition or third party that can take advantage of that, take that message and leverage that, then that can become a cudgel, that can become a wedge, and then we see how things shape up.
And that's a good point, Cecily. Sorry, go ahead, Ryan.
To point out, 7 years, 29 days. He's the 8th longest premier in the history of Ontario. If he serves out this term, he'd be the 4th longest premier in the history of the province. And I agree with everything Cecily and Quito have said. Stephen Del Duca may not agree with the lack of good opposition. It's impressive. What impresses me sometimes about Premier Ford, and I've certainly said the things that don't impress me on this show enough times, but what impresses me is, like, if you take Del Duca as an example, somebody that he beat in his own riding, like in his own city, that he then came and became mayor, a fairly popular mayor. And I ran into Mayor Del Duca at the last throne speech that they had, and him and Doug Ford are buddies. They're on the phone. Ford calls these guys up and has this way of no hard feelings and let's work together on things. So there's certainly, I think the history books will write many things about Doug Ford, but it'll be really interesting if somebody can dig in and find out what that magic elixir he has so far to stay relevant. Like, this is one of the few leaders that was with us through COVID that has managed to be able to adopt and adapt his ways to remain popular after COVID.
I was going to say, Brian, I don't want to take any digs at anyone, but it just, with Cecely's point, it just reminded me of during the election night in April, where Jamal Giovanni went on that rant about how basically, the Conservatives don't need to listen to Doug Ford because he didn't really face any competition. I compared it to like a WWE speech, and he's like, Del Duca, Bonnie Crombie, basically implying they're a bunch of jobbers and not real competition to it. And, just because you can beat them doesn't mean you can, you have enough, you have a strategy that could win a national election. But is this just the case that when you're so popular, like the opposition seems ineffective? Like, I feel like when the Liberals were in power, the opposition leaders they faced were John Tory. At the time seemed very ineffective, but he became mayor of Toronto for a good stretch. Tim Hudak seemed like a very well-liked figure, although he didn't lead them to any success. Is it just when you're that good, you make everyone look bad, or is he just faced no real competition?
I think when you say, it is interesting because even when you named the quote unquote opposition leaders or opposition MPPs, those were all Liberals. I think that the actual official opposition in Ontario has been the NDP, and I think that's where they just haven't been able to break through on the majority of their messaging and haven't been able to get through the criticism or the holding to account that you traditionally see in this dynamic. I mean, of course, they're also still, the Conservatives in Ontario still have a majority, right? So that's part of it. It is not a minority legislature. And either way, he's got 3 or 4 years, or the PCs have 3 or 4 years of a strong majority. So this will be more of a marathon than a sprint for all those involved. But truly, it is a unique situation.
I would add to what Cecily is saying is, the Liberals have had largely the same, the Ontario Liberals at least, have had largely the same 7 or 8 people as their top strategists now through the last 3 leaders. Typically, when there's a leadership change, yes, a leader is always the figurehead, but the team around a leader usually changes when a leader changes, and that hasn't been the case in the Ontario Liberal Party. And I think that that's some of what some of the change candidates in the Ontario Liberal leadership race are trying to make the point about. So there's some of that factor as well, that although the leader's been different, there hasn't been different people making the strategic decisions and the campaign decisions that might be required to actually compete against Doug Ford.
Quito makes a really good point. Quito, would you not also say, and you're the pollster, so you would see this better than I, but it seems to me that Doug Ford's a unique Conservative leader in that Conservatives always do well in the rural areas, but it seems like Premier Ford has his own popularity from him and his family in large swaths of like Scarborough and parts of Toronto, the Etobicoke. Like, there's like a little horseshoe in there that he seems to win on his own, which brings seats into play that other conservatives just don't seem to bring into play.
Yeah, I think the brand has appeal where other conservatives just can't play, certainly where Pierre Poilievre can't play. And you can't teach that, or, that's just the brand. And it's going to require a very creative leader and team to be able to figure out how to defeat that at some point. Otherwise, you'll just cruise to majority after majority after majority, and you might die in the premier chair. That was
Always the optimist, Quito. Always the optimist.
Quito, actually, speaking of provincial politics, I wanted to bug you a bit about Alberta.
Wow.
We seem once again to be hearing a lot of chatter about the Alberta separatist threat. But, has your polling identified any big shifts there? I think it's generally seen as something like over 60 to 70% of Albertans support staying in Canada. Is that still where things stand?
Yeah, I mean, I literally have brand new numbers on this, but I can't scoop myself because it's for someone else. But yeah, it's below 30%, and it stays there. Economic union with the United States is actually drops that number, oddly enough. And I think there are very few factors that would, the only factor that we measured that had any significant impact on the number was if the pipeline deal between Smith and Carney falls apart. That brings it up over 30%. So there is some political value to that, to the pipeline deal. It doesn't bring it, below 2/3, but it did move the number.
Mm-hmm. And Aya, sorry, go ahead, Brian.
Sorry, Quito. I was just going to ask, Quito, does the pipeline MOU and pipeline deal, does it actually add to Liberal chances in Alberta in the next federal election? Or is it just a policy that they kind of like and give Canada credit for, but doesn't really give them any more chance to win seats in Alberta?
No, I actually think, I'm going to say something pretty bold here. I'm going to predict that if there's an election in 2026, that the Liberals win 8 seats in Alberta, and it's largely on the backs of the pipeline deal.
Okay, while you're going all the way out on this limb, I'm going to push it a little farther. Those Calgary seats, Edmonton seats.
Where?
Yeah, I think it's well, look, Calgary and Edmonton are obviously outside the cities. There's zero. It's a massive lead, but in the cities, it's essentially a tie, which could lead to a Conservative sweep. It could also lead to a Liberal sweep in either of the cities or both. But it's more likely that the cores, remember, because when I say Calgary, Edmonton, it's census metropolitan. So maybe the Conservatives win sort of in the donut around Calgary and Edmonton, and Liberals compete in the inner cities. It's because of that binary. It's because of how low the NDP is nationally, although in Alberta it's a little bit higher because they have their provincial cousins that are actually doing quite well, but still back 7-8 points from the UCP. Yeah, I actually think if there's an election before June, Brian, mark my words, 8 seats for the Liberals in Alberta.
Is that a Carney draw? Like, that's just the...
It's 100% Carney. It's all about the imagine when we asked the question about separation under economic union with the United States, meaning essentially becoming the 51st state, the support for independence drops dramatically. So it's all about what's going on south of the border. Right now, the iron is hot. And if there was an election, I think we'd see some very unusual things.
I mean, look, that's super optimistic. I hope that's true whenever we go to the polls. But being a Westerner myself from a very blue part of BC and Kamloops, I mean, hey, if it happens, I'll have to give you kudos for that.
Quito is nothing if not bold. I will give him that.
You're muted.
Yeah, it's a very bold prediction. And I wonder if, Quito, you might change your mind depending on how things unfold on April 1st, when we have more information about how the carbon industrial pricing is going to be set to $130 per ton. And we're going to have some more information about who this pipeline proponent would be. I mean, just last week we heard from Enbridge that they won't be the proponent. They're not interested. They say it's too politically risky. They're still hurt from Northern Gateway that didn't pan out. And I think a lot of people thought Enbridge was a strong contender for taking that project on. So I think in 6 weeks, we might see whether the MOU will work or not. And I feel like that might change attitudes or perceptions of Ottawa and Alberta. I don't know.
I think the underlying thing that isn't going to go away between now and April or June is Donald Trump is still going to be Donald Trump. The threat to Canada's sovereignty and independence and all that brings is putting Canadians in a very defensive mood and very patriotic mood that we're not normally this rah patriotic country, but right now it's at an all-time high, at least in my political and polling career, 30 plus years. So,
I think there's also a reckoning or a recognition of even in some of the other polling I've seen, whether it's Angusread or otherwise, around the question of Alberta separatism and sovereignty, there's still a recognition that there's a benefit of being part of the Federation. You can get access to tidewater in BC, and that's not a possibility if they do decide to go forward with this petition or whatever it shakes out in May. And I'm hoping that, with this MOU and however that takes shape, as you said, in April, there is an appreciation of the benefits that come with being a part of Canada and working with your province to the west.
It's a good point.
As a resident Albertan in the group, I guess former Albertan, I would say that we're a young country and we can't take for granted our unity. We can't take for granted the solidarity that we feel, and you can't make these. I would hope Albertans don't make these decisions based on a moment or a feeling, but based on the history that we have and the long history that we have as a great country that's only emerging in the world. But the rest of Canada has a responsibility to step up and show the value as well in that. So I'm optimistic. I said it last week that we see the rest of Canada not take shots, and this is an opportunity to get political points locally, but continue to put Canada first and the importance of showing Albertans the value of being inside Canada. I mean, you look at the tidewater to the west, but also the great things that are starting to come out with the Port of Churchill and the opportunities that are going to come there. There's far more opportunities for Albertans to stay in Canada than if they leave. The simplistic argument that some people are making out there is a selling feature, but it's absolutely unrealistic what some of these people are selling.
To add to that, Brad, not a lot of people talked about this at the time, but I saw very few comments on it. But whether it's interprovincial trade or even pipelines to the east, we're now seeing in our polling for the first time ever support for pipelines in Quebec being at a majority level as a natural response to the threat of Donald Trump and our own sovereignty. And I think Quebecers in particular understand the threat to their culture and their identity that Donald Trump represents. And so finally, there's even an acceptance there that if it means national strength and economic strength and support for their culture and national identity, they're willing to accept pipelines through their territory as well.
Just wild. It seems to breed better unity in Canada than the Americans being reckless and scary. I feel like we're running against the end of the clock here, so I don't want to cut anyone off. So I'll get us to our final segment where we go through things that we're looking forward to in the coming weeks, or things that we want to flag that maybe got lost in the shuffle in the past couple of weeks. I'll start with you, Aya.
Well, it was really interesting when you brought to my attention earlier today that the King Ross Gold project is going to be referred to the One Project, One Process Ontario framework, which is sort of the equivalent of the Major Projects Office in the province. It's this sort of program to fast track permitting and regulatory approvals in this 2-year time frame. It's notable because it's the first gold project to get referred to a fast tracking process like that. We haven't seen that at the federal level in internal memos, but also like public referrals as well. And we hadn't seen that so far in Ontario. The other project that had been referred to were nickel and lithium. So gold is interesting because it's not tied to the tech era, right? It's not a critical mineral per se. And I think it's an interesting one because it gives jobs, but it's also very bad for the environment. It's tied to the wider financial system, but it's very much boom and bust, and it depends on pricing. Right now, gold has had a crazy rush in the last 2 or 3 years, but that's not necessarily going to last. So it is interesting that they're going to focus on a gold project, especially that this is in Red Lake. There's lots of other mining projects in the area. So I don't think that you could say, this is a region that has lost all this forestry work and needs new employment. This is why we need to fast track this project. I don't know that you can really make that argument. So it'll be interesting to see when they make the announcements later today why they have chosen that project specifically for that framework.
Cecily, how about you?
Sure. I just want to, take a moment and just reflect on the tragedy that happened last week in Tumbler Ridge and just kind of reflect on the moment that we saw later in the week with the Prime Minister and Poilievre and opposition leaders, as well as provincial leaders, really coming together in support of the community. And I think it can be rare, but it reminds us of the importance of those moments and the ability for Canadian politicians to go across partisan lines. In terms of what I'm looking forward to, less on the legislative side and more kind of in terms of our trade relationships, I know that Minister LeBlanc is working bilaterally with Mexico and a significant trade delegation primarily focused on agriculture in Mexico this week as it's a break week, and looking forward to seeing how that groundwork is laid coming out of Carney's discussions with Sheinbaum last year and how that continues to kind of shape up around our continuing engagement with more diverse partners internationally.
Absolutely. It should be an important trip. How about you, Quito?
Yeah, I think something that's been lost in the foreign relations is the situation right now in Cuba. Latin Canadian myself, I hear probably more about it than most people. There's only been a handful of stories in the news about it. I would like to see. I know the NDP spoke about it in the House last week. Some kind of government response. I know there's some emergency flights to evacuate Canadians living there, but some kind of humanitarian support. That I'm told that the situation on the ground is just absolutely horrible, and there's a large chance of really unfortunate things happening there. So in terms of the key things coming up, talked about the NDP leadership earlier, that there's also another leadership that's going to be somewhat significant, which is the CAQ. Francois Legault has resigned, and April 12th, they will elect a new leader. It's between Bernard Drainville, former media personality in Quebec, former minister under the CAQ. Oh, I'm blanking. Christine Frechette is the other individual who's running. That could change the core. The CAQ's been third, fourth. I think there was even one poll that had him fifth in the polls in Quebec for the better part of the last year. Could that reset things under a new leader post April 12th? I guess we'll find out what that new leader, what kind of stamp they put on the situation, and whether that changes the environment in Quebec before a fall election. Who knows?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, some great comments here today. So I don't want to make too much light of part of my topic, but I'm hoping Jamel Javani decides to stay home and stop trying to represent Canada abroad. You know what? I'm gonna throw a big shout out. Actually, the Olympics are here. The Olympics are on TV. It's bringing Canadians together. It's been great to see all our amazing athletes do such an amazing job. It's a unifying time. It was actually interesting to see my 23-year-old daughter, show me Prime Minister Carney talking to our first gold medalist. I think that was a smart move and well done. I want a big shout out to Team Homan, who we've got some personal friends here with at iPolitics with Emma Miskew. Everybody was counting them out. Everybody was starting to chirp about all their success. Now the big win against Sweden today, they're back in the hunt. I'm hoping that we get a couple gold medals brought home from our Canadian men's and women's curling team. And obviously, amazing to see the Canadian women's and men's hockey teams doing so well. So just a big shout out to our athletes and thank you for making us all proud, win or lose. They've done a great job representing us.
That's impossible to follow, Brian. Now you're making me feel like less of a patriot because that wasn't on top of my mind. I think there's a few things kind of percolating kind of under the radar that will be interesting to see how they play out when the House resumes next week. Obviously, of course, the budget bill is interesting, but remember, we still have an affordability bill that's going to bring in some tax cuts that still hasn't passed in the Senate. It might be held up because of concerns around a section that exempts federal political parties from privacy laws. Are the Senators really going to force a fight over a tax bill? I feel like that's pretty unprecedented. I think the last time that's happened was probably when the GST got imposed. So that would be an interesting fight. And then, of course, there's going to be a lot of kind of hand-wringing again around, our criminal justice bills. We have, of course, the newer one, C-16, But then, of course, the fight over the anti-hate bill, it's become such a politically toxic debate. But the reasoning behind that bill in terms of concerns from largely members of the Jewish community, those aren't going away. They haven't dissipated. So it's wondering how the government's going to do a job of stick handling that. At the same time, the Bloc putting out their hand saying, we're willing to help push this through, provided you make this or remove this exemption for religious beliefs from the hate speech crime. The fact that Liberals haven't progressed maybe tells me that they're having second thoughts about that deal. So very excited to see how that all kind of shakes out when the House returns next week. But with that, I want to thank Cecily and Quito for joining us, and I, of course, as always. Brian, it's great to co-host with you as always as well. Thanks everyone for listening. We'll be back next week with a brand new edition.
Thanks, Marco.
Thank you.